time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Charles Hardy. Charles Hardy resides in Venezuela and has been writing and speaking about political and social reality in Latin America for over 40 years. He was born in Wyoming and has visited almost every Central and South American country, and as a Catholic priest, lived 8 years in a cardboard shack in a Venezuelan barrio. He has been a frequent contributor to narconews.com and is here to talk about his book, which he co-authored with James Russell, titled Cowboy in Caracas, a North American's memoir of Venezuela's democratic revolution. Let's begin. If you could tell us what was the motivation in writing your book, Cowboy in Caracas?
I had the privilege of living, as you mentioned, for 8 years in a cardboard and tin shack in Venezuela, in a barrio. Barrio in Spanish means neighborhood. And so in Mexico, you'll have wealthy barrios, middle-class barrios, and so on. But in Venezuela, it's only low-income people. And I never met finer people anywhere in the world than the people I met in Nueva Tacagua, which was the name of the barrio. And I guess I wrote the book partly because I feel something of an obligation to those people. Venezuela is a very exciting part of the world right now, and there's a lot of misinformation about Venezuela. And I feel I wrote the book trying to express the opinion of important people that I know. Not famous people, but important people. And the important people are people like Juan, Maria, Jose, Javier, the ordinary people in Venezuela. And I think that's not what comes across with a lot of reporting that's done about Venezuela.
So tell us about how you ended up being in Venezuela.
Okay. I was a Catholic priest in Wyoming. Have you ever met anyone else from Wyoming before, Mike?
No, I can
No.
say I haven't.
It's, one time Johnny Carson and Ned McMahon had a discussion whether Wyoming really existed. And it was like that. Do you know anyone from Wyoming? No. And I think they decided there was just a hole in the map and Wyoming fit in there. And so some geographer made Wyoming exist, but it really didn't exist. And I felt somewhat the same way about Venezuela. I was a priest in Wyoming, and then I was given permission to go with a group of missionaries called Maryknoll Catholic group of missionaries, who kind of a unique group of people. Someone said Maryknoll was a little bit like Noah's Ark, only with this difference, only one of each species got on board. And I was looking forward to go to someplace like China, Africa, Brazil, Central America, someplace exciting in the world. And they said they were sending me to Venezuela. That was in 1984. And it was really a letdown. Venezuela was an unknown to me. It was like Wyoming, just a hole in the map somewhere. And I went, looked in the encyclopedia and said Venezuela had oil and cattle. And it sounded like I was leaving Wyoming to go to Wyoming. And these Maryknoll missionaries were concerned about working with the oppressed. And oppressed in Wyoming, oppressed in Venezuela. This was this exceptional democracy, and everything was perfect there. Well, when I got there, I discovered the reality was quite different than what the United States people thought about Venezuela, and was given this privilege of living in a cardboard and tin shack. And just to give you somewhat an idea about this, let me conclude one other thing. I stayed there until 1993, left because I was losing my sense of humor. And someone said early on, if you have to choose between poverty or joy, choose joy. And the people have enough poverty around them. I was losing my sense of humor. The house had been raided by the police, other things along the line. And came back to the States for a bit. But in 1994, I married. So I don't know if you know anything about the Catholic Church, but if you're a priest and you marry, well, that's kind of zip. And so since that time, I married a wonderful, wonderful woman, but after 6 years of marriage, we discovered we had a better relationship as friends than as married couples. So we're separate, but we're still friends and hope to be that way forever. So that gives you a little bit of background, personal background. But in the barrio, living in this cardboard shack, I remember one day I came out of the house and next door neighbor said, "Charlie, are you feeling better?" And I said, "Yeah, how'd you know I was sick?" She said, "Just the way you've been breathing the past few nights, we could tell you were sick." So you're very close to people. It was a government housing project, and I think this is important, a government housing project built when oil money was pouring into the country back in the 70s. That's the kind of housing that was built for people at that time. If they lost their home in a landslide or a road went through where they were or something. And so I've seen what life was like before in Venezuela, and I see what's happening now in Venezuela. It's just an incredible difference, the hope of the people and what is happening, not just the hope for what's going to happen, but the reality of what has happened during this time.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about some of the changes that occurred in that time. Did the people themselves rise up against the president then?
A great turning point in Venezuelan history that'll probably be there forever was February 27th, 1989. You might recall in 1989 there was the massacre in Tiananmen Square in China. That was in June of 1989. I think we had a worse massacre in Venezuela in February and March of 1989. Hundreds of people shot down on the streets. And again, up here, it didn't make that big of news. But what happened was the president who came into power at that time implemented the policies of the International Monetary Fund. And so that meant basically raise prices to their international level, keep salaries where they were. And prices just skyrocketed. To translate in U.S. terms, let's say you bought a loaf of bread today for $3, and in a couple of weeks it's $18. And all the prices just went up that way. On February 26, 1989, the price of gasoline went up. When people went to work the next morning, Monday morning, they discovered they didn't have enough money in their pockets to pay for the bus and get some lunch and get back. And Caracas just exploded. Within hours, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the street. And first it was food that was looted, then clothing, then television sets, then whatever you get your hands on. It was just massive frustration. No leaders, no organization, just that frustration. And eventually the troops were turned loose, and then massacre began. People being shot down on the streets. I raised the question in this book I've written about, is it justified killing someone because they have spaghetti in their hands that they've taken out of a store? The police originally were the ones in charge of keeping order, and some police officers ordered their men to do whatever they can to preserve life and so on. So they would stand outside supermarkets and make people stand in line as they looted, and tell them when they were going in, don't take any liquor or anything, just take the food you need. A whole different concept, and don't tear the place to pieces, just take the food you need after they've broken down the door or whatever and come out. But then the troops were sent, and among my memories were standing with a soldier holding an automatic weapon. I had my hands up in the air, had Levi's on and just ordinary shirt, and saying, the people here are good people, and but as people gathered around me, I also realized he could just mow me down. And I remember people saying, Charlie, go home, 6 o'clock. Don't come out of your house no matter what. They'll just kill you. That was 1989. Eventually, I did come out of my house because someone came to the door crying, please, take my sister to the hospital. She's dying. We went to the hospital. I went to the hospital dressed with all the vestments for a mass, because the young man who went along said, we're going to need all the help we can get. Dress up that way. And so we drove through these barrios that way. But someone recognized me when we were at the hospital later on and took me to the hospital morgue. There I saw the naked bodies of young people just strewn on the floor. And the year afterwards, I slept in the cemetery several nights. When a judge got wind of a common grave, the government said like 200 people died. But I could give you names now of more than 500 people, and the government denied that there were more people. Well, a judge got wind of a common grave, and in that grave there were 68 bodies that had been thrown in garbage bags and buried. We would be there around the clock so the government couldn't wipe out that site. But that's reality, and that's what gave birth to Hugo Chavez. He was a soldier at the time. He had mumps or measles or something during those days of 1989, didn't participate in that action. But he was meeting with other soldiers and civilians, and they were saying, Simon Believer once said, damned be the soldier who uses his armament against his own people. And they said that's what we were called upon to do. And so in 1992, Chavez led a rebellion, a coup against the president at that time, who eventually was impeached. But it only lasted like 12 hours, and about a dozen people died in that conflict. But they let him go on television to tell his men to put the arms down. And he said that he assumed responsibility for the failure. And he also said, for now, our objectives are not attainable. And the next day throughout the country, you saw on the walls all over the place, for now, for now, for now. And so since 1989, 1992, that hope has been awakened in the people that for now, our objectives aren't attainable, but someday they would be. And that's what happened. 1998, Chavez was elected president. By about 60% of the vote. It would be something like, if you can imagine this in U.S. terms, let's say in the next election the Democrats get 2% of the vote, the Republicans 1.5, and Mike McCormick is elected president of the United States with 60% of the vote. It was unthinkable. In Catholic terms, I'd say it was a miracle that happened. And since that time, he has stayed in power with 60 and over 60% of the vote in the elections which have come along. So it's been exciting. Interestingly, when he became president in 1999, one of the first things he did was send troops out in the barrios on February 27th, the 10th anniversary of that massacre, so that they would help paint schools, provide medical attention, and do other things, with the idea that military and civilians should work together in the creation of their country. And in time, I remember standing in front of a military truck with all these automatic weapons being pointed down at me and people at the barrio. In time, you would see military trucks these past few years on the street with soldiers, the trucks full of chickens, dead chickens, and the soldiers selling chickens to the people at low prices. And some generals didn't think that was what military should do. In peacetime, military should mow the lawn of the generals' houses and things along that line. But other generals said, no, our job is national security. And if people aren't eating well, then our nation is at risk. I tell people coming back to the United States for me is like being hit over the head. Being there is like being hit over the head daily in Venezuela, having to see things from a different perspective. But when I come back to the United States, I feel like I'm getting off a spacecraft and not an airplane, and not as an astronaut, but as an extraterrestrial being. Coming from a homeland security in Venezuela means getting food to people. I come here and I get these little tags in my suitcase every time I go through another airport telling me someone has searched my suitcase for homeland security. But nobody has put any food in my suitcase. Different concept, but exciting. I heard a general say recently that Venezuela has WMDs, weapons of mass development. He said, we have missiles here in Venezuela, missiles with books, missiles with medicine, missiles with bricks to build houses. A different way of thinking.
So talk about Hugo Chavez's popularity within the country since that initial election in 98. Has he grown more popular, remained the same?
In each election, his popularity has increased. That's not to say there isn't great division within Venezuela. I remember one time a man saying to me, have you ever been in any country where the people love their president the way we love our president? And I had to think, love a president? We vote for presidents. We put up with them. We say one's good, one's bad, or whatever. But love your president, it was a concept which didn't fit in my frame of reference up to that moment. But I also had to realize there's probably maybe nowhere where people so hate the president. It's been a real change in the structure of things. He would represent the ordinary person who would be the majority. The majority of people are not wealthy in Venezuela. I tell people if you want to understand, in my opinion, what's happening in Venezuela today, when you read the newspaper or hear something on the radio, we spell he in Venezuela with a T and a Y. Put a T before the H, a Y afterwards, and you come up with the word they. And so Hugo Chavez, he did this, he said that. No, no, change it to they. One day, I saw a woman on the street, and I said to her, "Are you a follower of Hugo Chavez?" And she replied, "No, he is following my ideas." A grandfather on the street, "What do you think of President Chavez?" It's as though he were my grandson. No, no, he is my grandson. People identify with him. Here he come. I was witnessing thousands of people on the street at a rally. He came through the crowd on the back of a flatbed truck, waving to people and so on. I don't know if you saw recently, he was in Haiti, and driving through the city, these people were running alongside the caravan, and he got out and jogged down the street with the people. And you saw all these smiling faces. I don't know what political leader he's following, if he gets his example from President Bush. Does President Bush usually ride on the back of a flatbed truck? But at any rate, this man next to me nudged me and he said, "Look at their eyes. Look at their eyes. The men are crying." And you can see tears in the eyes of the men. And I don't think it's because some God is coming through. I think it's because they identify with him. They can see themselves. They can see their brothers, their sons, their daughters, or their sisters, too. There's a new constitution in Venezuela since 1999. There's no sexist language in the Constitution. It says the female president or male president will do this. The female senator or male senator will do this. It's all that kind of language. Chavez would never say, I was in a restaurant one time in Mexico, and this person was singing, and at the end of her presentation, she said, "Gracias, amigos, gracias, amigos." And I said, Chavez would never say that. It's always, "Gracias, amigos y amigas," including the women, the feminine sector. I think the Venezuelan legislature at this moment has more women than any other legislature in the world. It's like 30% female.
So, talk about the power that he wields in the U.S. press and the corporate press. You get the impression that he's changing the Constitution or nullifying what Congress and the legislature there does. What's the truth to that?
It's not true. The ordinary person in the legislature and so on, I would say they've never functioned as well as they are at the present moment. It's true, for example, the Congress gave him the right to enact some laws to get things moving faster, and which is really necessary. If you go through sometimes the ordinary procedures of hearings, this, that, and so on, it can take years to get things going. And one of the problems in Venezuela is corruption, for example, and trying to find ways to get around corruption, inefficiency, and so on. It's not so much against the opposition as it is amongst people who have tagged along with the party, too. You're going to hear pretty soon about a television station whose license is not going to be renewed. And there's a lot of news about that throughout the world, taking away freedom of expression. But what's happening in Venezuela is this whole question: who owns the airwaves? Is it really fair that this multimillionaire is going to be able to get a license, buy a license, to have the airwaves for the next 20 years? He's been a dictator in many ways, deciding who gets on, who doesn't get on, one man. And so what you have throughout Venezuela right now are discussions in city plazas. What kind of television do we want? And May 28th, a new channel is going to go on the air. He can still go on cable television. He can have satellite. He can sell his products to others and so on. But his license isn't going to be renewed. And there's great rejoicing. Your independent producers are really excited about it. So what's happening is, yes, one person's freedom of expression is being limited, but thousands of people are going to be given the opportunity to express themselves. I think the figure is over 400 neighborhood radio and television stations in Venezuela at the present moment. The government sometimes gives transmitters to neighborhoods to have their own radio station. Now, what kind of a dictator, what kind of a controlling person wants that freedom of expression? And there has never been such freedom of expression as there is in Venezuela today. I have newspapers from the past with blank pages where the government censored the papers. Today, since Chavez has been in, the only time we've had limiting of expression was when the opposition took power for 2 days. There was a coup in 2002 against Chavez. Then there definitely was a rounding up of people, independent radio broadcasters and so on. And in the newspapers not printing, not going to press, television stations not giving the news when Chavez was coming back into power. That's the only time that there has been a limiting of freedom of expression in Venezuela. But so at any rate, the situation now is, yes, one man's freedom of expression is going to be limited somewhat, but thousands of people are going to have a voice that they never had before. So Venezuela isn't against freedom of expression. It's very much in favor of it.
What has been the U.S. government's role in the history of Venezuela while you've been there?
The United States, almost from the very beginning, the government policy seems to be do whatever you can to get Chavez out of office. He's a threat. But again, when I say he, I'm going to say they are a threat. Some of it is economic reasons. I go to a grocery store now and I buy cooking oil from Bolivia. I buy something else from Argentina, something from Brazil. Before, everything was coming from the United States. Uh, Chavez has this dream of Simon Bolivar that Latin American nations should work together and recognize their common roots. And so there are things such as, let's say, Telesur, which is competes with CNN, but it's giving news from Latin America by Latin Americans. I remember someone asking me one time in the States, or saying to me, he was watching Univision and some of these channels. He said, I didn't realize that all Mexicans were blonde and fair-skinned. Just think about this. Here you are in Venezuela, and someone says, this is CNN News in Spanish from Atlanta, Georgia. Well, it would be like this is CBS News from our headquarters in Moscow telling you what's happening in the United States. So there's a desire for what's called endogenous movement, coming from within. It's a very common word in Venezuela, endogenous, looking within ourselves to find new models for our society, for our world, for the country, and so on. And that's exciting, looking within ourselves. One of the things you might hear about, too, is socialism for the 21st century. What is socialism for the 21st century? Nobody knows what it is. But it's a search for, I know very little about any isms at all. Capitalism, socialism, I don't know much about them. But as I understand, capitalism centers on capital, on money, on things. Socialism should center on society, on people. Socialism was a flop in the last century. Capitalism only brought more poverty and misery throughout the world. Let's look then for a new model for socialism. But if we talk about that, we're not talking about necessarily Marx and Lenin. We're talking about Simon Bolivar. We're talking about the indigenous people in Venezuela and other countries. I'm told there's an indigenous group in Venezuela where the leader is defined as the one who listens. How would we rate our politicians as leaders if that were the criteria? The ones who listen. Chavez talks about Jesus, the early Christians. How did they live as a society? I suppose Marx and Lenin, yes, they come in too. I'm not familiar with them, but I guess they had something to say about socialism. And, what does Mike McCormick have to say about socialism, about society? What does Charlie Hardy? What do the ordinary people have to say about society? We've got to look within ourselves and dream about what kind of world do we want in the 21st century. And so it may sound threatening when people in the United States hear Venezuela is moving towards socialism, and so is Ecuador, and so are people in Puerto Rico talking about it. I was on a radio program in New York, and people from Ecuador were on, and they were mentioning 21st century socialism. Puerto Rico, 21st century socialism. So it's one of those realities, but keep this in mind. What we're talking about is looking within ourselves as a society and trying to dream of new models for the coming century. And everything in Venezuela isn't perfect. There's still lots of problems, but there is that dream. What can this world be? In which way can we go? And for some reason, that's threatening to the government of the United States. for some reason.
And it sounds like it's somewhat threatening to perhaps the large oil companies based in this country. I understand that Venezuela just recently finished nationalizing the oil there.
No, actually, nationalization took place way back in the 70s, and it was supposed to be 100% nationalization. It never happened. Right now, the nationalization that they're trying to get back to is that the Venezuelan government would be owner of 60% of any mixed company coming in. So it isn't something new with Chavez. This goes way back. But it's portrayed as though the government is taking over everything. The government has decided to buy the major telephone company for security reasons, and the electrical company. But the companies that are involved, they're happy because they're being paid a just price. It's like some other stockholder buying part of the stocks or ruling stock in these companies. But no, nobody's being cheated out of any money with this nationalization.
Just a few minutes left. So, what is happening in Venezuela also appears to be blossoming across Latin America and South America.
Right, and some of it maybe in the United States too. I think Citgo oil is owned by the Venezuelan government, and Citgo is now providing low-cost heating oil in I think 16 states throughout the United States. And someone said to Chavez, you have poor people in Venezuela. Why? And he said, but who buys the gasoline in the United States? It's people in the United States. Don't you think any responsible company should try to share some of that profit back with the people who are paying with that country? And again, you have to think about that. What about other oil companies in the United States? Are they doing similar programs? It's things like that. It keeps you thinking. Venezuela has been declared illiteracy free because of an illiteracy program as by the United Nations. Has the United States ever been declared illiteracy free, by the way? I don't know. But it keeps you wondering, do we still have lots of ways to go in our own country?
What about the barrio that you spent time in? Has that changed since you left?
Where I live no longer exists because there was a landslide in '93. But the people who lived in that area, almost all of them now are in new homes. Chavez insists that the new government housing have at least 3 bedrooms, one for the married couple, one for the male children, one for the female children. There's just light years difference between what existed before and what was done with the petroleum money before and what's happening now. Light years difference.
So after you're done with this current tour here in the U.S., do you go back to Venezuela?
I'll be back there. It's been 22 years now that I've mostly lived in Venezuela, and so I'll be going back there. I love this country. I love the people in Venezuela. I just wish our government could work toward a better relationship with the country.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
We've just been talking with Charles Hardy. He is author of the book Cowboy in Caracas, North American's Memoir of Venezuela's Democratic Revolution. And again, you can, in addition to his book, find out more through his website, cowboyincaracas.com. And he also has a web link there for if you want to trade emails.